I want to welcome each of you here. We have a power-packed weekend that you are not going to be sorry for attending. I am super excited about it. This is actually a culmination of a dream of mine for the last 2 or 3 years. And so for me, it's very exciting to see it finally come true. So I would like to briefly introduce our team that is here this weekend. If they could come forward just briefly. We just have the Beautiful Mind team from Auburn, California. This is an Adventist mental health clinic. I don't know how many of you know of them, but hopefully many of you, yes. And I see some smiling faces, so good, most of you do. I'm not going to give you too many of their accolades and who they are. You can see it on the back of your program here today. But I want you to know that we have a wonderful team here. If you've been listening to any of their the Brain People podcast, or if you've looked them up before you come here, what I want you to know is this may be the pretty faces that you've seen, but most of them are people that I've talked to personally, I've had interactions with in the past, and they're real people who have a passion for helping people think more like Jesus and have healthy thoughts. I say real people because sometimes we think that they're just these perfect people who live in their own echelon world. They're so smart, and they are, but they're real, just like us, and God has been working with them to help many people, including myself, which I praise the Lord for. And so, welcome. We are glad you're here. I'm going to turn the time over now to Amanda and let you have your first program. Oh, I was told to remind one more thing. At the bottom of your program, it says private counseling. Also, coaching would be the title we would have there. So that starts at 1:30. There'll be a sign-up sheet on the back table that's in the foyer. If you would be interested in that or have someone ask about it later, guide them to that back table. We'll have it signed up, and there'll be some awesome counseling and coaching sessions going on today. Thank you.
No, I think, there we go. I can tell now. Well, we are very happy to be here. I'm happy to be here, but I think I can also speak on behalf of my team too, or the team that came with me. They're not my team. But I want to speak with you this morning. I know it's a little bit different than a Sabbath school, but this is Sabbath school. And does anybody know off the top of your head what hymn 181 is called? It's one of my favorite hymns, and the hint is, I'm a therapist. Does anybody want to look it up and see? Does Jesus care? How many of you believe Jesus cares about your feelings? I do. And the reason I believe that is because, like Pastor Little said, I am not just a therapist. I am someone who struggled with depression and anxiety growing up. I think I had some very good reasons for that. And through it all, I saw how much Jesus cared. And one of the beautiful things that you will see in your life too, if you haven't already seen this yet, is God can take things that are difficult and turn them into your life profession even. And so that is what God has done in my life. But I want to share with you some things about depression and anxiety specifically that maybe if you're struggling with this, if someone you know is struggling with this, we can help you get a little bit of insight, and then you can take these things and you can also learn from them too. And that's the beautiful thing. One of my favorite verses in the Bible is Genesis 50, verse 20. And that's where Joseph was talking to his brothers after all of the struggles that he went through. And he essentially said to them, what you meant for evil, God meant for good. And I thoroughly believe that. I mean, you couldn't get me to question that one after the things that I've gone through and after the things I've seen other people go through. So let's start with looking at some of the signs for anxiety. Mentally, some of the signs for anxiety are worry or being on edge, nervousness, unease, panic, racing thoughts, hypervigilance. Does anybody know what hypervigilance is? Hypervigilance is when you're sitting on the edge of your seat waiting for something bad to happen. Does that make sense? And this is a hyper anxiety. And so some of us experience that, where you could be in a room, nothing bad is happening, but you're waiting for something bad to happen. You just feel it in your bones and you're underneath your skin. Anxiety signs that are physical, because anxiety often shows up in our physical bodies as well. So we can have difficulty and rapid breathing. We can have tightness in our chest. Sometimes even people think when they're having an anxiety attack or a panic attack that they're actually having a heart attack. But that's not necessarily the case. That tightness in chest can be an anxiety symptom, a physical one. We can have stomach aches and headaches. In fact, this is one of the ways that we know that children have anxiety, when they're often having or patternistically having stomach aches and headaches. They don't necessarily know that it's anxiety, and sometimes even adults don't know it's anxiety, but that's often how it shows up, especially if you've gone to the doctor and the doctor can't figure out why you might have stomach aches and headaches. But those can also be exacerbated by anxiety as well, too. So then we also have migraines, which is similar to the headaches, restlessness, muscle tension, fatigue, sleep problems, that can be sleeping too much or too little or waking up often throughout the night, hot and cold flushes, so it doesn't necessarily mean you have menopause, you can have anxiety, shaking, even bowel issues like irritable bowel syndrome can be a sign of anxiety as well, and dizziness. But who in the Bible do we know had anxiety? One of the individuals we see writes in Psalms, chapter 3, verse 1 and 2, "Lord, how are they increased that trouble me? Many are they that rise against me, many there be, which say of my soul, there is not help for him in God." This sounds like a symptom of anxiety. David's feeling a lot of anxiety here, and he had some reasons for feeling anxiety, and we're going to go through some of those later, but he definitely felt some anxiety. These are also some signs that someone might have anxiety. I mentioned signs like, headaches and stomach aches and things like that, but these can also be signs as well. People who have, or when we have phobias, like some of us don't like snakes and spiders, but how many of you, when you see a snake or a spider, have a panic attack or something like that? These tend to be where we get the phobias. Even public places. Germs, cleanliness, that's more when it turns into something like OCD, and even avoidance. So some people have social anxiety, and that often leads to avoiding certain social situations or being around people, and that has to do with anxiety over being judged or perceived in a way that is uncomfortable to that person. And then, like I said before, when it turns into obsessing and compulsions to ease the anxiety, that's when it's a form of OCD. So when we talk about anxiety and depression, we're not talking about just one diagnosis. What we're talking about is two categories. And within those categories are multiple different diagnoses, but right now I'm giving you an overview. You probably don't want to know all the nitty-gritty details of it, it's too much. But also having nightmares and flashbacks can be a sign of anxiety as well. So what is anxiety disorder not? Sometimes, we use these words like, oh, I have anxiety, and we kind of throw those things around, but we don't necessarily have a diagnosis of anxiety just because we're nervous to talk to somebody. That doesn't necessarily mean, you can be perfectly healthy and be nervous to talk to somebody who's maybe, has a certain position that you're intimidated by or something like that. Doesn't necessarily mean you have anxiety or a disorder. Having to confront an important issue, like maybe you have to do a project for work or something like that. That is anxiety, but it's not a diagnosis of anxiety. So you can have feelings of anxiety without having a diagnosis of it. Getting up to speak. I had a little anxiety getting up this morning to speak. That doesn't mean I have an anxiety disorder. That's a natural part of being human, and sometimes we become afraid of those things so much that it actually develops an anxiety disorder over it, when if we just told ourselves, oh, that's normal. How many people in here like to get up and speak? Oh, we have one, good. You can come up after me. And I'm just kidding. But yeah, most people don't like getting up and speaking. That causes some anxiety, but it doesn't mean you actually have an anxiety disorder just because you have that. Making a big decision and even taking a test does not necessarily mean you have anxiety. So now let's look at some depression signs. How about prolonged sadness and unexplained crying spells? When you have these patternistically or more often than not, significant changes in appetite and sleep patterns. That can also be. So you can see some of these overlap with anxiety as well. So you can have sleep problems with anxiety and you can have sleep problems with depression. Now this one is sometimes a little unusual for people to connect to depression, but irritability, anger, worry and agitation, irritability and anxiety. Oh, I put irritability twice. That might be because it's very strong. I forgot to take the second one out. But yeah, irritability and anger. Sometimes people focus so much on the anger that they don't realize what's the underlying issue. Sometimes people are depressed and that's what causes them to be irritable or angry and even aggressive too. Pessimism and indifference to things. Loss of energy and persistent lethargy. So a lot of us, when we experience depression, we don't have the same joy that we used to find in doing things we used to do. And maybe we don't even feel motivated to do them in the first place. And you can have lack of energy and it's not necessarily related to something else, but it's just that depression that comes over you. Sometimes when I think of depression, have you been to the dentist and they put that x-ray bib over you? That's what depression can feel like sometimes. You can wake up with that bib on you. You can, go throughout the day and have that bib on you, but it just makes you feel heavy, like you can't move sometimes. Some other signs, feelings of guilt or worthlessness. Poor concentration or indecisiveness. Not being able to make decisions and having trouble focusing. A lot of times when people have depression, they'll say it feels like a fog is over their brain and they can't get through the fog to even make a decision. Inability to take pleasure in former interests. We call that anhedonia. So if you want to impress your friends, you can tell people that word. Social isolation even. And sometimes this happens when people have, sometimes depression can be associated even with people pleasing. That can also be a sign of anxiety as well. But what happens when you spend a lot of time trying to please people? Makes you exhausted. And so you can actually do the opposite and isolate socially. Unexplained aches and pains. I love how God made our bodies. Sometimes if we won't listen to the thoughts that we have and pay attention to those things and work through them, sometimes the body starts talking to us through our aches and pains, saying something's not right here, you need to listen. And a lot of times, where do people go when they have physical symptoms? Go to the doctor, right? And the doctor says, oh, I've run all these tests and nothing seems to be the problem. Well, what's the body connected to? The mind. And when the mind isn't doing so well, sometimes the body will start to respond. And this is the beautiful thing about the body too, is that, did you know that every healthy thought that you have increases positive chemicals in the body? And every negative thought you have increases the negative chemicals, or the things that you don't want too much of at least. And what does that do? It increases, say, adrenaline or cortisol, and what does that lead to? Inflammation. What is inflammation the precursor to? All disease. So you take care of your thoughts, and we'll get to that a little bit later, then you take care of a lot of other things too. So, and also reoccurring thoughts of death or even suicide. And I like to suggest to my clients, when you have these recurring thoughts, that think of it as like an unhealthy person in your life that's trying to convince you of a lie. That's the depression talking, those thoughts, trying to convince me to believe them. That's not necessarily the truth being spoken, or it isn't the truth being spoken. It's like having somebody you don't trust trying to tell you something that you know is a lie. And we see David also dealt with depression. I am weary with my groaning. All the night I make my bed to swim. What does that mean? I make my bed to swim. I love the poetry of Psalms. What do you think David was doing that caused his bed to swim? Crying, even perspiration? Yeah. Do these sound like symptoms of anxiety and depression? Yeah. I water my couch with my tears. So what depression disorder is not, and this isn't to say that this couldn't be, but it isn't necessarily just because this person is experiencing it. So grieving after a breakup, that doesn't necessarily mean you have depression. Is there appropriate times to grieve? Absolutely. What is grieving a sign of? How much you care about somebody. We don't grieve if we don't care, right? So isn't that nice to know that people might grieve if you're not around or if something happens to you? Absolutely. But we can grieve well versus poorly. So in just a generic sense, grieving is not necessarily a sign of depression. Grieving after a loved one or pet dies. Grieving after the loss of a dream. Sometimes we think grieving only happens with loss of people in our lives and even death, but sometimes we can grieve things that we've hoped for, things that we've worked really hard for, and when those things don't work out the way that we hoped they would, we can also grieve those things as well. And also, my favorite one, being a teenager. Sometimes people think because they're teenagers, they all have to be depressed. But no, that's not true. Not all teenagers are depressed. I hope you know a teenager or two that isn't depressed. So no, that's not a sign of being a teenager that you're depressed. So please don't think that that's normal for teenagers. But then we also have, often associated with depression, is self-harm and suicide signs. So these are some things that you might want to consider if you think somebody could have depression or might have depression, and you want to make sure that, they're not going to hurt themselves. Scars, and not just scars, but they tend to be in patterns. So what I notice with clients that I work with is typically if these are self-inflicted scars, they tend to be on the non-dominant side of the body. So if I'm right-handed, where are all my scars going to be if I put scars on my arm? On my left arm, because I'm doing this sort of thing. And they tend to do it in certain patterns and keep going along. So that can definitely that is a sign of self-harm behaviors. Fresh cuts, scratches, bruises, bite marks, or other wounds. Now, I'm not saying that you should be suspicious of any wound that you see, but if you notice that these keep happening and this person doesn't have an issue with bruising easily or something, sometimes the older we get, the more likely we are to bruise. But if you see patternistic bruises, if you see patternistic scars or scratches or bite marks or that kind of thing, that can definitely be a sign of self-harm and suicide. Excessive rubbing of an area to create a burn. Now, when I was very green at being a therapist, I didn't realize that people don't just cut, they do other things. They burn sometimes certain areas, and I've worked with people who've put out their cigarettes in their own skin. I've seen people take like the end of their pencil, the eraser, and rub it on their skin to create a burn mark and that sort of thing. So all kinds of things can be used to self-harm. Keeping sharp objects on hand, and wearing long sleeves or long pants even in hot weather. Now, this one isn't necessarily a sign. Sometimes, especially in young people, they'll wear long pants and long sleeves in the summertime when it's 100 degrees out and 80% humidity, because sometimes there's just some insecurity with the body, and so they don't want to show their bodies and putting on a lot of baggy clothes and that sort of thing. But if you notice that person might have some depression and stuff and is often doing that, that might be a sign that they're covering up certain areas of their body that they have self-harmed. Frequent reports of accidental injury can also be a sign. Difficulties in interpersonal relationships, when you see that person having roller coaster type relationships with other people, that can be a sign of other things as well besides depression. But when you see that person constantly in and out of relationships or having trouble with getting along with people well, that can also be a sign, because sometimes that causes that person to feel worthless and then go into self-harm behaviors. Behavioral and emotional instability, impulsivity, and unpredictability. These are the people that, again, have difficulties in their relationships, and then sometimes to seek attention, they'll do certain behaviors, and they're not typically trying to inflict or do suicide behaviors, but they'll do it maybe to get attention, and we have to be careful because sometimes those people will actually not realize what they're doing and can inflict more harm than just attention-seeking behavior. Statements of helplessness, hopelessness, or worthlessness, and overachieving even. How many times have we heard, the valedictorian of the school committing suicide? Sometimes people, I like to think of symptoms and symptoms in terms of a spectrum. We don't all do the same thing when we're feeling certain things. Some people go to one extreme, which we've seen a lot of these self-harm behaviors, but other people go to the opposite extreme and try to work harder and do more to overcompensate, so to speak, for these things. And so even overachieving, when you see that person is driving themselves to a certain point, even overworking can be a way to deal with depression for some people too. And because especially for, say, men, crying isn't as socially acceptable, I can be angry and I can work really hard. And so if you see somebody seemingly driving themselves to an endless point, then that might be a sign that that person could also be susceptible to these things. I also want to talk about contributors, though, because, when we think of David, there were certain things that actually contributed to his anxiety and depression. When you think of him in his younger years, he seemed very confident, didn't he? When he went before Goliath, he was very confident. He didn't seem to have a struggle with anything. But then his life changed quite a bit. And he started to have these fears and these worries and stuff. So let's look at some of the things that might contribute, not just to what David went through, but to what we can go through too. And one of the big ones is dystopian themes. This is quite popular right now. I know a lot of us, when we are parents, we look at our kids and we go, oh good, they're reading. But we don't often think about what they're reading. And reading is actually quite popular among teenagers and young people right now, even adults. But what are they reading? And what they're reading are these dystopian themes, and these are themes that focus on societies with great suffering or injustice. But, we might have great suffering and injustice in our society, but what's the difference? When there's no savior involved. Now we, as Christians, we know, we have an end in sight, and we can look forward to that end day. But what happens when the only person who can save this society from this injustice and suffering is another human being with all kinds of faults and that sort of thing? And sometimes, it feels good to read these things because, oh yeah, we get to identify with the hero in the situation, but we realize this person can't actually save everyone. And it becomes a very sad, state of believing when we are tempted to believe that this is the kind of society that we live in. But also, our society isn't just full of injustice and suffering. What else is it full of? Good things, and even people who are inspired by their relationship with God to help others. I remember not too long ago we had, there was some flooding in Houston, I think it was. Does anybody remember that? Serious flooding in Houston. And I remember looking at I don't have television, but we went on YouTube and looked, and it was one of the most beautiful things I've ever seen. In the midst of all of this suffering and pain, the news, and this was the news actually showing this, was miles and miles and miles of trucks with trailers and boats behind them, trying to get off the freeway to do what? To help. And I thought, wow, where did all these trucks and boats come from? They had come from all over the country. People had taken time off. They had spent gas money to get to this place to start rescuing people because they knew first responders weren't going to be able to do this fast enough with all the pain and suffering that was going on. And I thought, this is also the world that we live in. But when we focus on these negative themes over and over and over again, what are we tempted to believe? That God isn't doing something in the midst of all of these things too, right? And so these dystopian themes can very much be a source of why we become depressed and even anxious. How about drug references? A lot of people, this is becoming more and more mainstream, is like, well, if I can't deal with it, I'll just find some drugs. That'll help. And marijuana especially is becoming just commonplace. Oh yeah, I do it, everybody does it. Everybody on TV seems to do it. And so what do we think? Well, I guess I can't get through without this. And what happens when you're younger and younger and this becomes more commonplace? You don't realize there are other options, especially if that's what you consume day to day. Crime scene shows, it encourages social anxiety and even fear of being around society. That also happens with the news too. I like to think of the news as like a soap opera. It's the same story every single day, you just change characters. So-and-so burglarized, well, tomorrow somebody else did it. But what are you taking? You're taking your whole environment and you're pinpointing one bad thing that's happened. Well, aren't there other good things that are going on? But that doesn't show up in the news so much. Fear is a great motivator to keep watching the news. That's why they do it. Pornography, sex, and abortion, and I would even add to this masturbation too. These things actually, there's a lot of mainstream research being done on these topics, and this is a huge factor for depression and anxiety in our culture. We love to think that we're more free when we get to do all these things, but in fact, these are actually increasing anxiety and depression. And I could go into all of the other, chemical reactions that happen in the body too. I won't for time, but these do have some very real factors, and there are some people out there that aren't even Christians that are saying no to this stuff because they realize that this isn't helping them. It's actually causing all kinds of other problems too. Social media, it's easy to share without filtering. You take 1 second of your day and you put it up there and somebody else goes, oh, my life isn't that exciting. It's that 1 second of somebody else's day. And we tend to live vicariously, but we don't all know the stuff that's going on. Fear of missing out too. Do you know you're always missing out? If you're here, what are you missing out on? Being somewhere else. But if you're somewhere else, aren't you missing out on being here? If you're a parent, what are you missing out? Sleep. If you're sleeping, you're missing out on having kids and being told I love you and having that just adoration that comes with those little ones looking up at you thinking you're the world to them. We're always missing out. We should have the joy of missing out. I'm experiencing this right now and I'm appreciating it. But what is all of the advertising and marketing is to convince us that we're missing out all the time, and so we need to buy something else or do something else in order to be truly happy. Technology. Sometimes it's just the addiction to being busy, and if you know anything about all the people who develop the technology, they don't let their kids use it. But we all think our kids need to have these things. They don't. Shows, movies, chat rooms that normalize depression and suicide. I can't tell you how many times I hear somebody who just suddenly found out what their diagnosis is, and so they go online, they find a chat room, and they spend hours and hours and hours talking to other people who have depression or anxiety or whatever their diagnosis is. And it's nice at first, but what happens when that's all you're talking about? That's all you're looking up. You become so entrenched in it, it's really hard to get out of that. So we don't want to necessarily do that. Focusing on the negatives, tragedies, doubt, even end-time events. This is a scary one to put out there. I've worked with a lot of kids who are depressed and have a lot of anxiety because of hearing about end-time events. Now, does that mean we should stop talking about end-time events? No. But what's wrong with only talking about the bad stuff and not talking about the hope that we have? Sometimes we love to focus on all the conspiracies and all the bad things that are going on, and the little ears that hear us talking about those things, what does that tell them about their future? It's scary. So we need to also balance that with the hope of knowing Jesus and how he's going to carry us through those things. Poor diet and exercise. I hope this is an obvious one to many of us, but when you think about your body, think about it in terms of your dream car. If you could get your dream car, now some of you, like me, don't even have a dream car because just driving is fine. But if you had your dream car and you saved up for that thing, or you looked and looked until you finally found it, would you just put any kind of gas or oil or lubricant on that thing? No, you put nothing but the best stuff on that car or in that car. But how do we treat the bodies we'll never get a replacement for? You can essentially replace a lot of parts on a car, but you can't do that with your body and especially your mind. And if we don't fuel our bodies and our minds right, we're prone to be depressed and anxious too. Our food is our fuel, and we have to pick our fuel wisely. Substance use and early sexual experiences. This is often we love to talk about these things. I could go on and on about this one in the news with some of the things that we're hearing about in terms of abortions and stuff like that. But I'll tell you that all the stuff that you hear isn't necessarily what people are thinking. And it's only behind a closed door do they say how it's really affecting them. And I'll say this, I've never met a woman who's had an abortion that didn't know to the day how old that child would be. What does that tell you? It's not as easy to forget as they like to suggest. And that child becomes like a ghost to you the rest of your life, especially when you have other children afterwards too. A guilt is created. Why these kids but not that kid? And so these things are very real things that can cause us to, be depressed and have anxiety. And I have about 10 stories that I could tell you that go with that. Living in opposition to our values. Now this is where I think David really suffered, because he knew God, what God could do for him, and he did some things that were very much against his values. And he realized that after, especially when Nathan introduced him to that. Focusing on being happy versus duty and work. Our society loves to focus on whatever makes you happy, but what happens when that doesn't come with any kind of effort? I just want to be happy. I want you to make me happy. I want this thing to make me happy, rather than I want to do the kind of work that's hard and creates a sense of meaning and purpose, and even a little bit of dopamine at the end of it. There's something really awesome that comes with doing a lot of hard work. Any of you ever worked on something so hard at the end of it, like you jumped up and down practically because it felt so good that you accomplished what you set out to do? I love that feeling. It's quite addictive, but it's a healthy addiction to love to do work and to see something come out of it. And sometimes it's not even that great of quality. I'm speaking for myself. But I just know, I tried really hard at this, and it's nice to see that, something came out of it, and maybe I'll do better the next time I do this. Lack of prayer and Bible study and a relationship with God. Now, I think this one should be an obvious one, but so many people today think that they can do it on their own. And often I think, how is it when you get to the point in your life where you think you are the highest authority, or maybe even the president is the highest authority, and then you mess up, or the president does something that you don't like? Where is your faith now? It's destroyed. But when you know God is ultimately your authority in life, no matter what happens, no matter who hurts you or frustrates you or things don't go your way, you know God can make something good out of that. Now that creates real peace and real, satisfaction in life. So when we have these things and we notice we're, not in the direction that we'd like to go. Maybe we're experiencing anxiety and depression. What can we do? Well, one of the things that we can do is something that in secular terms is called cognitive behavioral therapy. But in fact, it's not a new thing. What does the Bible say? There's nothing new under the sun. And so when Aaron Beck came up with this concept, he did not come up with something new. This something is actually from the Bible, in fact. And when we talk about cognitive behavioral therapy, we're just talking about the fact that my feelings and my behaviors are a result of my thoughts and how I think. And Philippians 4 verse 8 sums this up very beautifully. It says, "Finally, brethren, whatsoever things are true, honest, pure, lovely, of good report, if there be any virtue, if there be any praise, think on these things." So what are we supposed to put our thoughts on? True, honest, pure, lovely, and things of good report. So how do we do this? One of the ways that we do this is by asking ourselves the true and helpful question. So if I'm going to ask myself if my thoughts are true, the first thing I would need to do is look for evidence. Now, where's the best source of evidence for a Christian to find out if something is true? The Bible. But sometimes we still struggle with that. So we can ask ourselves, what evidence supports this belief that I have? Now, I love going into a courtroom. I've been a juror twice. I love the process. I used to want to be a lawyer when I was younger. I realized, though, that I probably like to fight too much, so that wouldn't be a good thing for me. So I decided to become a therapist instead. Not really, it wasn't that quick. But when we look for evidence, how does evidence come to us? We have to look at all the evidence. And when you're in a courtroom, the evidence comes from two different sides. One that supports something and one that goes against something. So that's the same that we want to do. But do you know our human brains don't like to do this? And I'm going to get into this more in detail later on today. But our brains don't like to do this. You know, we're naturally set up to only look for evidence that supports what we believe, even if what we believe is really faulty. So if you want to be a wise and healthy person, you need to look for also the evidence that doesn't support what you believe. Are you willing to do that? If you believe that nobody likes you, are you willing to look at maybe some people that have shown you kindnesses and support and compassion in your life? That's also evidence. So we need to do that. But here's the other thing the brain doesn't like to do. The brain does not like to stop when it has no evidence. Our brains love to fill in the blanks even if we have nothing to fill them in with. This is why when you have witnesses, one witness isn't necessarily helpful in a court case. You want more than one witness. You want multiple witnesses because you want their stories to be the same. That's what tells you, oh, maybe there is some truth to this. But human beings, if we don't have enough evidence, if I believe that nobody likes me and I haven't asked anybody yet, it's easy to believe that nobody likes me. But if you want to be wise and you want to be a healthy individual, you need to reserve the ability to not pass judgment on something until you have more evidence. So to be able to say, you know what, I don't have enough evidence for this, I'm going to set that aside until I have more evidence. I'm not going to make a decision on that. I'm not going to believe something yet until I have more evidence. That is what it will help you be wise and helpful to yourself and healthy to yourself. And I love what David said in Psalms 3:3-6. But thou, O Lord, art a shield for me, my glory and the lifter up of mine head. I cried unto the Lord with my voice, and he heard me out of his holy hill. Selah. I laid me down and slept. I awakened, for the Lord sustained me. I will not be afraid of 10,000s of people. Now, was he afraid? He was afraid, but he says, I will not be afraid of 10,000s of people that have set themselves me round about. Why? What was his evidence? That God was taking care of him. How did he know that? Had God taken care of him when he was tending sheep? Had God taken care of him when he went up against Goliath? Absolutely. So he had evidence that went against his initial belief. So we also want to look for things that are helpful, because some things are true. Some things absolutely have happened. They are difficult. But when we ask ourselves the question, is it helpful? We have to ask ourselves, does this help me move forward, or does it keep me stuck? And David said to this, Psalms 4, 8 and 9, "Depart from me, all you workers of iniquity, for the Lord hath heard the voice of my weeping. The Lord hath heard my supplication. The Lord will receive my prayer." He knew that he didn't have to be discouraged. He knew that he didn't have to be anxious, because God will hear my prayer. He has heard my prayer, even if I haven't seen the outcome of this yet. So what can we do? When we're telling ourselves lies like, my problems could never be solved, I could never feel truly happy or fulfilled, how about I can name several problems that have been solved? Do you know, sometimes we like to eliminate the obvious ones. So I'm going to ask you a question, and I think you all can answer the same way. How many of you had trouble tying your shoes when you were younger? How many of you learned to tie your shoes and now know how to tie your shoes? Was that not a problem that was solved? Absolutely. But we like to ignore those ones. But everything that is a problem can be solved. It's just a matter of time. How about, I'm basically worthless, defective, and inferior to others? How about instead, just because I feel worthless doesn't mean I am? Is there a difference between feelings and facts? Many times. If feelings were so true, no kid would ever have to go to school when they were afraid. We'd say, oh, you just stay home until you're not afraid anymore. No, we have them go to school so that they can see that that fear is not accurate. How about, if I'm numb, I need to hurt myself to feel something? Instead, I can try healthy ways of feeling. Or, no one will understand. They already have their own problems to deal with. Instead, maybe I haven't asked the right people or enough people. My problems are important too. You know, sometimes when we have problems and we don't have enough supportive people around us, the problem isn't the supportive people. The problem is the people we're looking at to support us. We haven't gone out of our comfort zone yet. And sometimes going out of your comfort zone is the best place to get support. Or how about, no one cares, they'd be better off without me? Instead, some people care and God cares. This isn't the end of my testimony. So, if you do want some help with this, these are some resources that you can use. I especially love Mind, Character, and Personality. It covers pretty much everything, especially the second volume deals more with the mental health stuff. The first volume deals more with the physical stuff, but they do overlap a bit in between. Telling Yourself the Truth is a great book. I recommend. This is a Christian author. And then there's Learning to Tell Yourself the Truth is a workbook. You don't have to have the book to do the workbook. The workbook will still be helpful to you. And then one of the books that we actually incentivize the people in our office to buy, all of these books we encourage, but the SOS Help for Emotions book, it is more accessible to people who aren't necessarily Christian, although the author is a Christian. And it's SOS Help for Emotions, and it does go through these true and helpful thoughts. It helps you with cognitive distortions and other sorts of things. And we actually let people buy this from us when they're in our group, and if they do a book report, we pay them back for the book. After, of course, they read it. We want them to read it. That's the whole point. But this is a really helpful book. And you can seek for cognitive behavioral therapy. I could make a shameless plug for our online group that is now accessible. So even if you can't come to California, although we do have people come to California and stay in Airbnbs to do our group, you can actually do this online now. It's even more accessible to you. So you can do the CBT therapy. I also recommend true meditation. So we hear a lot about meditation, but there's a true form of meditation. And meditation, according to Psalms, is meditating on God's word and his promises. That's a great resource for when you're experiencing depression and anxiety. Your brain cannot do two things at the same time. So if you're meditating on God's word and his promises, what can you not be thinking? All the bad stuff. Now you can go back and forth between the two, but as soon as you go back, you should go back to meditating on God's word and his promises, and you can also meditate on being grateful too. And I know Mariola is going to talk about gratitude later, but I wanted to share with you an especially powerful quote that I found in Spirit of Prophecy, and it says, "I saw him looking on the dark side, distrustful of himself, and looking down into the grave." Now, what does that phrase, looking down into the grave, mean? Yeah, having very depressed, suicidal thoughts. Now, did you know that Spirit of Prophecy talks about suicidal thinking? Isn't that amazing? If you read this stuff, you find really good treasures. He must not dwell on these things, but look to Jesus, a pattern that is unerring. He must encourage cheerfulness and courage in the Lord. Talk faith, talk hope. Do you have to feel faith and feel hope to talk it? Not necessarily. You can do a lot of things that you don't feel. So talk faith, talk hope, rest in God, and not feel that a severe taxing effort is required on his part. All that God requires is simple trust, to drop into his arms with all his weakness and brokenness and imperfection. And Jesus will help the helpless and strengthen and build up those who feel that they are very weakness itself. Isn't that what depression and anxiety feels like? That you're very weakness itself. God will be glorified in his affliction through the patience, faith, and submission exemplified by him. Oh, this will prove the power of the truth we profess. It is consolation when we need it. It is support when every prop of an earthly nature, which has been a measurable support, is removed. I think this is very encouraging. What's the chorus of Does Jesus Care? Oh, yes, he cares. I know he cares. His heart is touched with my grief. When the days are dreary and the long nights weary, I know my Jesus cares. He does care about your feelings. So, shameless plug for our podcast. If you'd like to listen, there are a lot of helpful things for that. But I want you to remember, most importantly, that God does care. And sometimes we don't see the end from the beginning, but yes, he cares. I know he cares. Should I pray? Yeah. Dear Father in heaven, I thank you, Lord, that you care, and I thank you for sending your son Jesus to prove how much you care for us. And Lord, when the days are dreary and the long nights weary, help us to remember and to dwell and focus on your word and your promises, and to talk faith and to talk hope. And because of all of the things that we have hope in, and because of Jesus, we ask these things in his name. Amen.
Good morning again. Were you blessed? Did you learn something? Uh-oh, there's a few folks here either not listening or didn't learn anything. It's all right, I'm sure you did. It is a blessing to have each of you here. I want you to know at this point we're going to have a little bit of an intermission. We're going to start song service at 10:50, and then around 11 o'clock is when our standard divine hour comes. So you're welcome to stand up, stretch your legs, get a little fresh air. Bathrooms are if you're going out these double doors, are to your right. Just follow the signs. You are dismissed. We'll see you back at around 10:50. Thank you.